We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam and winning the just peace we all desire.
Let's talk about President Nixon. He knew he must end the war just because of the pressure of the politics in this country. So early 1970, he gave order attack to Cambodia because the communist central headquarters, they locate along the border, they command the war in Vietnam. But they are very safe because the U.S. troops and Vietnamese troops never, invade over there.
Throughout the entire American experience in Vietnam, there is a constant concern that the Americans are fighting the war with one hand tied behind their backs, that North Vietnam is allowed to work through these neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail weaves its way through both of those countries and is a major artery in terms of moving supplies and manpower down this trail into South Vietnam. And so after a secret bombing, which occurs in 1969 to hopefully hit and disrupt the North Vietnamese sanctuaries, Nixon agrees to a cross-border operation in the spring of 1970.
Here we are trying to stop this war, and it's escalating. That was traumatic. I mean, I remember watching it on TV. He was showing us, he had a map there showing us the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was going through Cambodia, and this is why we have to interdict and, invade and bomb the people of Cambodia, and this is, all because of the Soviet expansion and the weapons that the enemy of the North is coming in the South. I mean, just pure lies.
The announcement on April 30th of the invasion of Cambodia completely shocked the country and galvanized an anti-war movement that had actually been in some state of confusion and disarray for the preceding few months. There were protests all across the college campuses. And very famously and tragically, there were 4 students at Kent State who were killed by National Guardsmen in their protests against the war.
I sort of felt like, gosh, this is just getting worse and just getting worse. And then what happens on May 4th is just, it was very, 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 very hard and very, very tough. I wasn't sure if this war was ever going to end.
The mayor of New York, John Lindsay, had called for a day of remembrance for the Kent State 4. So there were about 200 anti-war protesters gathered outside of the stock exchange at Wall Street. A number of construction workers attacked the anti-war protesters. Around 70 people were injured. The Nixon administration pounced on it, associating themselves with the hard hat demonstrations and valorizing the actions of the hard hat construction workers. Nixon had spent the preceding 2 years depicting the anti-war movement as elite, as impudent snobs, as taking daddy's money, and also as being unpatriotic, rabble-rousers, and that helped bolster Nixon's credibility. In fact, it was after the Hard Hat riots that the first labor movement anti-war protest was held.
The fact that we'd been involved in Vietnam didn't mean that we were particularly supporting the war. Right? We just got swept up in it. The old cliche about people who hate war the most are the people who've been in war is probably true.
There was a lot of class resentment, a feeling that these entitled protesters were shutting down the colleges, burning buildings, creating havoc. So there was an anger at the protesters, not necessarily support for the war. In fact, some people said, well, I think the war is a terrible thing, but these protesters are awful.
I think I got arrested 14 times in various cities for protests against the war. The first time I spent a week in jail was in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1970. We blocked the driveway to Nixon's White House. I'd wake up with a sweat every morning. I was afraid to take showers. I had 2 friends who were raped in the jail. I had one friend who got a lead bar cracked across his head. We fasted the entire time. I didn't eat at all either. So it was a traumatic experience, a scary experience.
When we were being briefed in Okinawa on our return back to the United States. They told us not to wear our uniforms when we got home. I mean, I was a Marine. I was very proud of being in the Marine Corps. And decorations aside, you know, I mean, it's just, this is my life. This is what I've been doing. And you're telling me it's not valuable, it's not worth it, that somehow I should, you know, hide it. It was very uncomfortable. You know, I think that the anti-war movement here in this country had a huge impact politically on ending the war, you know, and I kind of applaud them for that. But I think deep down inside, I can never forgive them for the way they treated the troops.
A lot of people say that the anti-war movement spit on the soldiers when they came home, when we have only found one instance of that, and even that person regrets having done it. And that gets fabricated into how the peace movement was so unpatriotic and how the peace movement was so insensitive to the military. So one part of this story that I would like to get told is that it's patriotic to be against war, even if you can only right now think that it's patriotic to be in the military. Just because we care about people in other cultures and we care about our own military and our own soldiers, we care so much about the soldiers, we don't want them to go fight wars.
There were two sets of talks. There were the public plenary sessions that took place between all four sides involved in the war. There were secret bilateral talks that took place between only the United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So the South Vietnamese parties were not present, but it was their fate that was being decided. Both sides really did not want to conclude a settlement until they scored a major military victory.
I was not prepared, and most people were not, for the Easter Offensive, because it was the largest action since the Tet Offensive. There were three major attacks at Quang Tri and Kon Tum and An Loc. It involved 130,000 troops. They attacked An Loc with tanks, and tanks had never been seen that far south before. So the intensity of that battle surprised everybody.
Le Duan was hoping that his strategy would bring Vietnamese Communist forces to victory in a very, very difficult time, because you just had, sort of major announcements that Nixon was going to visit China and visit the Soviet Union, the first time that an American president would visit either of those two countries. This had a devastating impact on the North Vietnamese leadership, and they launched that spring-summer offensive right in between the Beijing and the Moscow summits. The 1972 Spring-Summer Offensive was an offensive that once again showcased Le Duan's desire to push forward his general offensive, general uprising in a different incarnation. He thought that the window of opportunity arose once again to topple the Saigon regime.
About 4,500 ARVN were surrounded by 30,000 North Vietnamese and under siege. So essentially we lived in bunkers. We took artillery from the enemy on a regular basis, day in and day out. And mostly what the advisors did was to put in airstrikes.
In 1972, they tried to attack us without U.S. troops. But we handled them well. Just because the U.S. support, they still have supporting airplane B-52 and also some Navy from the outside support. So we need just support, no ground troop. We win that, and we control our country well.
In a very real sense, the Vietnamese won a great victory in '72. And in fact, Nixon declares Vietnamization a success. But parenthetically, they were a success with massive amounts of U.S. support.
The effect of the failure of that offensive to topple the Saigon regime and to also derail this sort of great power collusion was that Le Duan finally had to turn to the diplomatic sphere and negotiations. Le Duan had always believed that the sort of puppet collapse was intimately tied and connected to American withdrawal. So if the two government could be overthrown, then the Americans would inevitably have to withdraw. Following the Easter offensive, then Le Duan starts changing his tune, and he wants to focus on negotiating the Americans out. That's what Ho Chi Minh had wanted his whole life, is to just deal with the Americans first and then turn to the enemy in Saigon and vanquishing them at a later point.
In the aftermath of the '72 fighting, both sides made significant concessions. American concession was that we had been insisting all through the war that the condition of any peace agreement had to be that North Vietnamese troops would withdraw. And we dropped that. The Vietnamese side had been insisting for all those years that we would have to oust President Thieu and dismantle his government and create a so-called government of national unity. And they dropped that demand. And over the next month or so, Kissinger and Thaw completed an agreement which was accepted by both sides, down to the final word. The South Vietnamese government was excluded from those negotiations. They had some inklings about what was going on, but they were not included. After this draft was concluded, an assigning date was set. Kissinger went to Saigon to get President Thieu to sign on.
What Kissinger didn't know when he arrived in Saigon in the fall of 1972 with this draft agreement was that the South Vietnamese had already acquired a copy. And they didn't agree with many different aspects of that draft agreement. The South Vietnamese government believed that Kissinger was duped by the North Vietnamese negotiators. Thieu's handwritten notes, his angry notes, which calls Kissinger every bad name that he could think of in 3 different languages, sort of foreshadows the death of this draft agreement and how there would not be peace in 1972.
Kissinger then went back, and in effect, he backed out of the agreement that he had already signed on to. And we resumed negotiations to try to meet the South Vietnamese objections. When the renegotiation broke down in December, Kissinger and Nixon decided to resume bombing North Vietnam and carry out these heavy raids in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. And that was what became known as the Christmas bombing.
Vietnamese communists called this 12 days of darkness because the skies were darkened by all the bombs that fell. This was, B-52 raids that this fell continuously over North Vietnam.
And a few days after that, a new agreement was reached, which differed in no significant way from the agreement that had already been reached in October. The claim that the bombing forced the North Vietnamese into accepting a peace agreement this is not just speculation or logic, it's proved. You can read both those documents and you can see that they amounted to the same thing. So they didn't sign anything in January that they weren't willing to sign in October before that bombing took place. But Thieu came around.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. In the settlement that has now been agreed to, all the conditions that I laid down then have been met. A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time.
The peace agreement had 2 parts. It called for a ceasefire in place, and both sides were supposed to stop shooting, and then a political process to occur leading to elections that would supposedly create a new government in South Vietnam that would then make whatever arrangement it could make with North Vietnam. Neither side respected the ceasefire. Neither side ever made a single move to implement the political provisions.
When the Paris Peace Accords are signed with a ceasefire in place, it leaves all of those North Vietnamese troops who were not destroyed in the Eastern Offensive still in South Vietnam. And to me, that was essentially a death warrant eventually for South Vietnam.
Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war throughout Indochina will be released. There will be the fullest possible accounting for all of those who are missing in action. During the same 60-day period, all American forces will be withdrawn from South Vietnam.
By March 73, all U.S. troops are gone, with the exception of about 60 military in the Defense Attaché office. The South Vietnamese are on their own. As Thieu says, a third Indochina war starts. And so the South Vietnamese do very well in 1973, and a lot of heavy fighting. 1973 was the 3rd highest year for South Vietnamese killed in action.
My family was pretty hopeful. The South Vietnamese army was strong. The Americans had equipped it, and they thought that the South Vietnamese army could hold out for a while if the Americans continued to give us economic and military aid and keep supporting the troops with bombing.
When we stopped bombing in 73, stopped bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam runs all that material and equipment and replacements down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Before the agreement, if one soldier, they want to infiltrate from North Vietnam to the south, it took him 6 to 9 months. After the Paris Agreement, they take them only 3 days. Now they can go a battalion, regiment, they take Molotova all the way to the border and they come to the Vietnam because at that time no more B-52, no more airplane, no more reconnaissance, no more aerial photo.
After the Americans pulled out completely, the economy began to crumble because jobs disappeared. You know, the whole country was supporting 500,000 American soldiers, right? When they left, a lot of the jobs went with them. There was war in the Middle East and an oil embargo. Inflation was very high. The government was very corrupt and inefficient. Students were out in the street protesting. General Thiel, who had become head of the country by that time, was extremely unpopular.
The system was incurably corrupt. The whole government structure in South Vietnam was a military structure. Promotions were for sale. The military used its power to extort money in, every way they possibly could and pass it on up the line.
In mid-74, they began to run into problems. Nixon is embroiled in Watergate.
The time has come for me to speak out about the charges made and to provide a perspective on the issue for the American people.
Dealing with a very confronting Congress, U.S. military aid is reduced, and essentially the South Vietnamese began then to feel the squeeze. By mid-74, they're rationing artillery rounds, they're rationing grenades. As time goes along in 74, of course, Nixon, who made 31 promises that the United States would be there for South Vietnam, in early August finds himself out of office and disgraced.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon essentially said, we will be there like we were in 72. And Tu believes that to the last minute, despite evidence to the contrary.
In 1974, Congress voted to cut aid. The military had proposed $1 billion or $1 billion plus in military aid for South Vietnam, and Congress cut that back to $700 million. So a significant reduction, but there was never a cutoff. People sort of attribute this to the left wing, the peaceniks, and that movement had no influence. And what had really changed in politics was that once American soldiers weren't there, the American public didn't really care what happened to Vietnam.
My parents always had this fear that in the end the communists would win. The Americans only gave them hope as long as they were there. But now, with the Americans gone, the whole country, sunken into this despair, they began to feel afraid. In 1975, the communists decided to launch an offensive, hoping that they could end the war and defeat the South Vietnamese government.
My family lived in a small town called Ban Ma Thuột in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, which had the distinction in March 1975 of being the first town overrun by a communist invasion. My brother was 10, I was 4, and my mother had to make a life and death decision, and the path that she chose was to flee that town with my brother and me, and we walked, I think 184 kilometers downhill to the nearest port city, which was Nha Trang. We were lucky to actually get on a boat to get to Saigon, where we found our father.
You have to remember this was an enormous human tragedy. A couple of million Vietnamese were fleeing from the communist forces, evacuating families of soldiers under terrible, terrible conditions.
And a month later, the communists arrived in Saigon as well. And we were lucky again to catch another boat out of Saigon and make it to Guam.
The communists thought it would take them into 1976 to take over the country. But in 1975, like a few weeks later, they were outside Saigon. And they were setting up the barrage. They were going to shell it and then take it over.
I was the man during the last day of South Vietnam to go to Washington to plead for an emergency aid of $700 million. But the Congress refused.
President Ford went on television. He presented to Congress another supplemental request for $722 million. This was in the middle of April. No one could possibly have believed that any of that aid was really ever going to get to South Vietnam in time. By then, the end was inevitable. And even the defenders of it, most of them didn't say, we're going to save South Vietnam. Most of them said, this is to save America's reputation.
I used to say it was not a good page in the history of the American by then. They refused to give South Vietnam a few $100 million, while in the same time the Soviet Union and China, they added the North Vietnamese with their tanks and with the whole equipment to invade South Vietnam by then.
I just felt this immense sense of impending tragedy. I knew that if the North Vietnamese took over, the results were going to be horrendous.
When the Americans started playing that song, White Christmas, then they knew that that was a signal for the Americans to get to their evacuation points, and the country was about to fall.
One night, an American who spoke fluent Vietnamese called my brother and said, you can leave the country, but you only have until tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. to get out. Bus picked them up and took them to the airport. That was April 29th, the day before the communists came in. Rockets were beginning to fall. The communists were starting to shell. So they thought they were going to die there. And then suddenly, early in the morning of April 30th, they looked up and they saw these big choppers coming in and landing.
All of us had sort of felt like this war was going to go on forever. You know, that neither side was strong enough to win or weak enough to lose.
When the French were defeated, at least there was this climactic battle at Dien Bien Phu, you know. But Saigon just fell, just like a ripe fruit, you know, it just fell.
I was in a really, really deep depression for weeks following that, because it just made everything I'd done just suspect, you know. What was this all for if we're just going to walk away?
A number of my friends died either in prison or in concentration camps. Some of them escaped by boats in kind of hegiras that you could only imagine.
I didn't care who won. I didn't care who lost. I only cared that the war ended and that Vietnam now experienced peace, and that the country is once again united.
We are not very happy with the American, attitude about how they disengaged from South Vietnam, you see. I have to add it, and it is a very important too, that it was in many ways compensated by the welcome that the American people welcomed the Vietnamese refugees who came to this country. They thank the American people for this welcome, because they leave us free men now here in the U.S. They have their families, they have their children. The children go to school, to college, and it is quite a successful community of Vietnamese right now in the U.S. And we thank the American people for that.